and uncover the power of neuroscience in fostering change. Now, before we get to that, we're sending a big hello out to our audience today, our registered Zoom participants, as well as our friends streaming across our social platforms. And regardless of what platform you're on, let us know in the comments section. Speaking of comments, just a quick reminder in Zoom, make sure that you select everyone or all panelists and attendees so that we can see them. So where are you all joining in from? Sharing the chat with us. Belgium, nice. LA, Florida, Bay Area. Nice. Keep those coming in. For our regulars, it's great to have you back. For those of you that are new to your Brain at Work Live, welcome to the party. For some context, it is the title of one of the best-selling books by our CEO and co-founder, Dr. David Rock, and it's also the name of our blog and podcast. We are recording today's session, so if you're interested in a replay, be on the lookout for an email later today. That email is going to include a survey for feedback, as well as a number of resources that are aligned to today's conversation. We also suggest putting your phone on Do Not Disturb, quitting out of your email and messaging apps. That's going to allow you to get the most out of today's discussion, and it's also going to help with your audio and video quality. And lastly, we love interaction, so feel free to share your thoughts and comments with us in the chat. We love to have these conversations with you. So before we get started, let's introduce our speakers for today. Our first panelist is one of NLI's best and brightest. She studied emotional functioning in people with neurodegenerative disease in her PhD program at UC Berkeley. Her experience as a researcher leads our biggest projects at NLI, translating social and neuroscience findings and distilling that information into learning solutions, research summaries, and journal articles to help organizations grow. Speaking of growing, she's an expert on growth mindset, speaking up, power dynamics, and right now is helping lead the charge on science behind our solutions on various topics. Please join me in welcoming Vice President of Global Research here at NLI, Dr. Michaela Simpson. Michaela, it's great to have you here today.
It's great to be here, Shelby. Thanks.
Thanks. For our next panelist, a long history of driving change and building culture in large, complex organizations has given her deep expertise around DEI practices and principles, especially in the area of communications. In fact, she broke barriers as one of the first, and for a long time only, Black C-level speechwriters in the Fortune 100. Her 3 TED presentations challenging businesses to get serious about inclusion have collectively over 2.5 million views. Her superpowers: applying neuroscience to solve DEI challenges, building actionable DEI frameworks and strategies, and brokering honest DEI conversations among top leaders. Please join me in welcoming NLI's Global Head of DEI, Janet M. Stovall. It's great to have you here, Janet, and I'm passing it over to you.
Thanks so much, Shelby, and I'm looking forward to having this conversation today. I'm sure you saw the topic and you thought, what in the world? Well, here's the thing. Juneteenth, we're talking about Juneteenth today. Juneteenth, the holiday itself, is a celebration of freedom. But with that celebration, there should come a degree of acknowledgement that freedom is never really free. Now, slavery may have ended in Texas in 1865, but its legacy endures, not just in Texas, but everywhere, in the institutions of this country and in the minds of Black Americans. So Juneteenth is relevant, not just as history, but as an opportunity to discuss some current realities and some future possibilities. So as Shelby mentioned, I don't know if she mentioned that intro, I can't remember, but I wrote a book. And if you've read that book, or if you've seen either the LinkedIn post that I put up about Juneteenth, what you'll know is that I'm a firm believer that if you're going to step into conversations about diversity and social justice, you should do that by furthering them, by applying something that's unique to you, your unique expertise to examine the issue differently. Now, NLI knows neuroscience, and we know the brain. And when you think about Juneteenth from the standpoint of the brain, one word comes to mind: resilience. So that's what we're going to be here to examine today. Let's start with a definition of what resilience actually is. Okay? Given what we know about resilience, namely the capacity to cope and adapt in the face of adverse life experience, I'm going to pose this question to Michaela, who understands the brain better than any of us here. What about the brain helps us to be resilient, Michaela?
All right, that's a big question, Janet, but there are so many ways we can go with this. But if we, again, anchor on that definition, which is broadly, that capacity to cope, to withstand, and not only just to kind of withstand and endure, but it's actually to adapt and adapt in a positive way in the face of adverse life experiences. That can be in terms of trauma, chronic stress, which can come in many different forms. And so why are some people better able to cope and adapt, and why are others not? There's so many factors available. Right now, when we talk about the brain, we can think about what the more intrinsic, like, what's happening inside us. Because when we'll get to this later, that element of, what can help us outside of ourselves, extrinsically in our social relations. So if we think about, okay, we're experiencing something really adverse, potentially traumatic, very stressful. And often there is this idea that this can be something that's chronic rather than acute. I mean, you can adapt quickly to something, say a car accident, but what's happening when we experience something that's adverse? It can throw us off, right? And it can create, at NLI, we talk a lot about threat states, right? It can create this threat state, this fear state. And, let's think about, let's take a real life example. Let's just talk about resilience and people, we're talking basically about African Americans who've experienced a lot of, let's just broadly say, adverse life situations. So where you go out in the world and you might be encountering behaviors and people who don't necessarily view you as an equal. And so that can do a lot to somebody's self-esteem. It can do a lot to, what's happening in the world. You can become hypervigilant. And so some of those things we can think about, some of you heard the term amygdala, right? And this is not the only thing, but this is, when we are experiencing threat in our environment, we can really experience activation in our amygdala. And really our amygdala is not just about fear response or negative. Our amygdala is just paying attention to what's happening in the world. And it's ongoing. It doesn't sleep, right? Even when we're asleep, it's monitoring what's happening. So, if you're a new parent, you don't have to be a young parent necessarily, but a new parent, how we might be asleep, but we're alert to the cry of our child. And so we're just always, our amygdala is always on alert of what's happening, what's entering my environment. Now, if we're subjected to consistent forms of stress or experiences that we basically can call traumatic, that takes its wear and tear. And there's so much energy going towards that part of the brain of like, okay, what's going on? I need to protect myself. We can consciously or unconsciously be in fight or flight states that we're really not going to be in that, that place where, we're kind of calm and we can be centered and reasonable. Often that's attributed to our prefrontal cortex, right? That's the area, our executive functioning, where we can reason, we can think analytically, we can collaborate with others. Our bodies are in a more engaged, relaxed state, like even now, right? I'm not having a fear response. And so when we're in situations that are kind of creating threat or fear, it's going to take its toll on us in that moment. So we're not going to be able, if you're a child and you're sitting in school, you're not really going to be able to pay as much attention. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Let me ask a question. So when we talk about that in terms of that chronic stress, how does that relate to what really people are living right now? In the workplace, we see studies all the time about how it's different to be, being Black at work is very different than it is for anybody else. What does that chronic stress, how could that affect us in the workplace? Are we at our best? Are we able to deliver as much as we could? I had a former manager who told me one day, just kind of came in with this pensive look. And he says, "Can I ask you a question?" Which always means you're going to get something interesting coming. And I said, "Sure." He goes, "You do great work. How much more great work could you do if you didn't have to worry about what it meant to be Black here?" And I said, "Oh, lots." And, the conversation didn't go any further than that. But talk a little bit, if you can, about what it means, how that might affect what we do in the workplace every day.
Right. Let's think about, if we showed up fully resourced. And, in this context, we're talking about African Americans. There are many situations I'm sure you can all identify with that where we might be coming to work under-resourced for any number of reasons, because we're, caregiving for people, you don't have access to transportation, any number of things. So we're going to talk about, as an African American coming to work. And for those of you who are familiar with the history of the United States, we have quite a tragic history around this. And so we as African Americans are carrying a lot of this, and you'll hear Janet and I will talk. We'll talk about intergenerational transmission of trauma. So I don't know if some of you've heard that term, but basically there's a thing where they're finding that it is actually showing up in our DNA, and not only in terms of, you know, our health, our physical, mental health, and our ability to recover from lots of stress. We're actually seeing it in our genes. Such interesting information around this. So there's a lot we're already carrying, and we go out in the world and we kind of have to put on our armor. And so it's not like we wake up and have a nice, you know, sleep and we skip to work and it's all wonderful. I mean, it might happen with some people, but it's that sense of, yeah, what would happen if we were fully resourced? But there are a lot of other things we're carrying with us, we're carrying in us as we go to work. And this is even in the virtual world and not just in person, that, you know, you're not waking up with a cup half full, right? You're waking up with and I'm an optimist, but you know, your cup.
No, I'm a cup half empty.
Yeah.
No,
So your cup is emptier than it
Yeah.
is full. You know, it's more empty than it is full. And so when you think about what it takes for people to show up and do their work, and they're still doing stellar work, just like that quite intuitive, insightful statement that man made. Wow, if you didn't have all this other stuff you had to contend with, how much better could you be? And so we think about that extra load you have to carry, an effort you have to put in, which is very taxing on the brain. So even just to show up and be like, okay, I need to monitor my actions, pay attention, read other people, understand the perspectives, what's my political capital, what are the power dynamics, you know, these are happening anyway, but we take all these other social elements and we think about the brain, there's only so much information we can process. So yes, we're not going to be fully, I like to say, in our, you know, prefrontal cortex where, you know, we can gauge at this level. So, and again, I think it's a testament to many people who show up and perform at top levels, but it's taking its toll physiologically, psychologically, that are not always visible to everybody else.
You brought up something, and I'm probably going to take you totally off of your train of thought, but you know, we knew that was going to happen.
I love tangents.
Okay, good. Okay, because you brought up the point about intergenerational trauma. And the reason when we first started talking about doing this episode, you know, there was my belief that you ought to tie it to something to take the conversation a little bit further. But when I started getting ready for this, you know, the term epigenetics came up a lot. And so to think about Juneteenth and think about the fact that we have a bridge to those people who were formerly enslaved, who were set free. First of all, I'm assuming everybody knows what happened on Juneteenth, namely that the enslaved in Texas found out 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation that they were free. Yes, the slave owners knew that. They just chose not to mention it because they didn't have to. And so it took the federal government coming in and saying, no, you're free too. It did not end slavery everywhere in America because there were still some places where slavery was still there, but it ended it in Texas. So that's what Juneteenth is about. It's a celebration that happened on June 19th in 1865. So that's what it is. Back to that. So when we think about the term resilience, and we think about, it's real easy to look at resilience back then and say, if you survived slavery, you were resilient. It's interesting to look at it now and say, if you survived the workplace as a Black American, you're resilient. But intergenerational trauma and epigenetics talks to us about the fact that that stress that happened back at the end of slavery is still a part of us who exists today. So can you talk a little bit about what epigenetics says about this and what that actually means?
Well, you know, epigenetics is that integration or that intersection of, okay, we have genes, right? We're born with genes. Some might be, you know, we have mutations or whatever else. But just because you have a gene for something, say Alzheimer's. So I studied neurodegenerative disease, Alzheimer's and frontotemporal dementia among some of them. So one could, for example, have a gene that could make you more susceptible to getting Alzheimer's, but that doesn't mean that gene will be expressed, that you will get it. It's there. And the idea is that, yeah, just because you have that gene doesn't mean it will get expressed, but the environment in which you're in, and that could mean literally your physical environment. Do you live near a nuclear power plant? Do you work in a coal mine? Are you in a very dangerous area? Are you part of a subjugated population,
Mhm.
what's your family environment? It could be, environment very broadly. So what are those external factors that might play a role in triggering a gene? So say for Alzheimer's or something else, and you could even be identical twins, or you could be twins, and there are all kinds of interesting studies, same background, whatever else, and you share like a risk factor for a particular, like just say Alzheimer's, but one sibling gets it, one doesn't. So again, it's not a pure genetic thing. It's also the environment and what's triggering it. And so that's all to say, because in a way you would think that, people who've been subjugated for decades, centuries, or however you want to call it, on the one hand, you could say, man, that is horrible, and they must not be resilient, or all these horrible things happening. You would expect, say, more cases of psychopathology or suicide, or, people not really surviving. But people generally, humans are pretty resilient. And so, but what are those factors given like really horrible things happening still? Why is it that some people seem, can have most horrible things happen to them? And yet they're standing there, they seem to be, not only intelligent, engaged, they're able to cope. And then others not. And so it's like a very complicated story, because it's not like, oh, African Americans were enslaved. Yes, we're carrying a lot with us, and yet we still prevail. And that's, like everybody, there's some who struggle more so than others. But what are those, those factors? And like, if I can bring it back to the brain, is more about what's happening in the brain. There's certain things of like, even when we're born, and what are our experiences? So you could say this is the environment, right? What are our experiences? We might be born into adversity, and families that for generations have experienced adversity that have made them, say, more susceptible for things like hypertension. You hear this, right? Hypertension, and not going to live as long. And yet there's this resilience. And if you're in this supportive environment, and they're even finding, like in the brains, like there's certain areas where some people, where there is more adaptive people are more adaptive to stress. And those are in certain areas like the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, where there's like a larger volume in that area of the brain. There are certain things like there are neural markers for optimism, right? When people are more optimistic, and even in the face of adversity, they can be more optimistic around that. So we're seeing, speaking very generally with humans, areas of the brain that are indicative, that are thinking, oh, these can confer protection in a way in the face of adversity, even when we have this history. So, it's a very complicated picture. And yet as humans, we're extremely adaptive. And, a lot of this is finding these coping strategies. And again, some are kind of intrinsic, but again, there are ways that we can also learn to become more resilient.
Well, let me throw a question here, because I know that this is, even when we were planning this episode, one of the things that came to mind was when we celebrate or acknowledge resilience and understand that that's what it has taken, that's what, intergenerationally, we've had trauma that we're born with. It's kind of born as part of us, that has it had physical and psychological impacts on us. But how do we avoid the propensity to say, well, isn't it great that you guys are resilient? Most of us have heard the strong Black woman trope, you all can survive anything. So therefore, let's just keep doing bad stuff. Let's not worry about it, because you know what, you're going to get through it. How do you get away from that? What is it about resilience that is good? We know it's good, it keeps you here. But, we talk about chronic stress. Chronic resilience seems to be a thing too. And I'm just wondering, is that not great? Is it not okay if you have to constantly be resilient? So that's not a good thing. It's not a positive thing. Just because you can do it doesn't mean you should have to. What are some of the things, and you started talking about this a little bit, but what are some of the things that having this need to chronically be in this state of resilience, what can that do to you?
Well, it's almost like, I don't know if it's so much that it's super conscious, but when you talk about like kind of the Black, for those of you like the strong Black woman syndrome, it's like yeah, Black women are strong, you know, they've been single mothers, they've been, you know, they've faced so much adversity, and yet, you know, they can weather the storm. And it's a real phenomenon. A lot of Black women take that on. But what's key around that, I'd like to make that distinction around the thing, I have to do this. It's actually not so much about resilience. It's this belief that I have to do this on my own. Or if I say I need help, then I'm not being the strong Black woman. Because, right, we will accept a lot of, you know, in a way, it's kind of a positive attribution, but not really. But
it's an attribution if we give it to ourselves. It's
right.
It's not attribution. Exactly. It is an expectation from everybody.
But it's else. That thing. If there's that expectation, and even it might be among your family, or you have children, and you don't want to show your vulnerability to your children, or to your community because you're supporting so many other people. You know, you might be caretaking, and you know, having a career and a family and all of that, and so you don't want to show your vulnerability because for any number of reasons. And so I think part of that reason where that added burden of stress, they find that Black women will not necessarily share what they're experiencing or really getting the social support that they need. And part of that is also just admitting, like, this is rough. And this might be generational. I don't know how it is kind of with the younger generations, but and you get to a key point of, like, when we think about, you know, beyond ourselves with resilience, how important social connection and social support is. And if we are like, no, I can't show my vulnerability, I just have to get work done because I don't have time for that stuff, that's going to take even more of a toll. So, and yet we're still resilient. And so, yeah, there's this element, and thanks for bringing this up, Janet. It's kind of interesting, like, yes, resilience is great, right? Because you can positively adapt. But then are we saying, yay, that's great, you get a badge, move on, we don't need to worry about you. So
because you got this.
Because you got this. But it still takes its toll with the things, like, why do we have to be resilient all the time against all kinds of things, you know, being thrown at you? That's probably not really how it was usually meant to be. So it's, again, all of this is very complicated and complex. So yes, it's a positive thing to be able to be resilient. And in certain ways, certain psychologists will label that as, hey, you didn't end up getting, you know, chronic depression or, you know, diagnosable anxiety, and you're, you know, you don't have a certain psychopathology. Hey, you don't have bipolar disorder. You don't have this and that. You're great. But we're still, and that's not to minimize people who actually have those conditions as well, or struggling with those challenges. It's, yeah, just because you have something that's not diagnosable doesn't mean that everything's great. I'm going to put a smile on my face. And so that's where community is so important, because we can't do this on our own. And I just want to go back to the science a little bit. It's super interesting. I'm super excited where this is going. This has been going around for probably more than 10 years or so, but this aspect that, like, even in terms of neuroscience, and I was speaking very broadly, and like, you know, let's put somebody in a scanner and do a test. You know, neuroscientists are realizing, you know what? Guess what? We exist with other people. And so we can do things and, like, even test and put people in a scanner. Of course, you can't really mimic real life in a scanner, but what's more realistic is us in relation to others. So there are things where they put two people in a scanner, they're next to each other. They'll have some things where people in a scanner and they'll be holding the hand of somebody, and like, are kind of related to resilience, kind of people experiencing some type of threat or, like, literally physical pain. And then their experience of that pain will be alleviated when they're holding the hand of a loved one. And you'll see areas of the brain, like the ventral medial prefrontal cortex and the ventral striatum, are coming up almost like this protective thing. Janet's got me here. And so we're even seeing that in science. And now they're doing different types of technologies where people can be linked. So they don't necessarily have to be in a scanner, but, like, what is our experience in the world with others? And so, you know, I think a key piece of resilience is to realize we're not alone. And even if you might not have all those kind of intrinsic resources, maybe you're not the most optimistic person, but maybe you have a best friend who is, and will hold your hand through that journey.
Well, how do we, Well, first of all, thank you for all that. I mean, and the way you're describing you had a very, very wonderfully scientific way to describe, which is that dumb statement that I think is a dumb statement. What doesn't kill us makes us stronger. I personally hate that. I don't want that to be my option, my only two options. But that not being said, you talked about the healing factor of society. You know, if we acknowledge that trauma is real, trauma is intergenerational. You know, you started using the term earlier a little bit about weathering. You know, there are studies that say that this trauma weathers people. That's why we have certain chronic diseases that are more prevalent in Black American populations and all that. But what do we do about this? I mean, we don't want to have this sense that, oh, woe is us. We are just always going to be this way. But we also don't want to be in a world that says, okay, since you're resilient, then we can just keep throwing it at you. What is it that we can do as individuals? Because we do exist in society, what is it that other people can do around us? What happens in their brains? What kinds of things can they do that can help make this better for everybody?
Sorry. Yes. And I think you mentioned that, you know, part of that is acknowledging other people's lived experience. Like you might not have experienced that, and that's okay. And don't feel guilty because of that, but just really understanding that everybody, people are individuals. And so like even you and I, Janet, we might have the same skin tone, but it doesn't mean we have the exact same experiences. We probably have things that are similar, but really, how do we get to know somebody and understand somebody's lived experience and just really believe that and take that in? And how do we form those connections? Because sometimes just literally hearing and acknowledging somebody of like, oh, they get me, that goes a really long way. And, you know, how can we do that in our everyday life? Because we can go out and be making assumptions about people left and right. Where can we pause in that and catch ourselves? Oh, I just made that assumption that person walking down the street, blah, 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 blah. And not that you go up to that person and you say anything, but maybe that will influence the next time you have a face-to-face interaction with somebody who's different from you, to understand their different experiences that are out there. And I keep on going back to social connection and really understanding, you know, if you're in the workplace and you're a coworker or a leader, where can we create interaction situations and systems in the workplace that make it more equitable or more, I don't want to say just pleasant, but a place where people can come in and they can lay down that armor. You know what? We have this common goal to do this in our work, and we're all here to do this. And we really value everyone. Where that is really enacted, that is a space when people can just, you know, breathe. And it's not just psychologically safe space, it's a brave space, it's a courageous space. You know, it's really around creating those environments. And when we can like take off that armor, what that does physiologically in the body and how that, you know, in a way takes us out of that threat state in our brain, then we could click back more into, okay, let's engage this executive functioning and let's get to work and let's relate in a way that we can respect one another, but we can also think analytically, we can engage in problem solving without all this other noise in the ether. But I'm curious about you. Like, I mean, you've been so great. You've been asking me these questions really from your perspective and what you've seen, you know, especially with your expertise around communication, and also your lived experience and your knowledge around, you know, epigenetics and intergenerational transmission of trauma. Like, what's coming up for you as we're having this conversation?
Well, in some ways, you know, it's difficult to look at the reality of intergenerational trauma. I mean, we're seeing it. Just recently, we had another situation where a celebrity, somewhat an athletic, an Olympic runner, died in childbirth. And one of the things that we talk about often is the maternal morbidity and mortality among Black women, and that has something to do. I mean, they're the obvious, the things that people think are obvious, like, you know, well, maybe there's a different level of education, maybe there's a different level of economics that make that true. But studies have shown that no, you can be wealthy and highly educated as a Black woman in America, and you are still 3 times more likely to die in childbirth or have your child not be okay. So we start looking at those reasons. And one of the things that they've talked about is weathering, this concept that just the trauma that is part of your everyday life, whether it's visible trauma, whether it's just being that person in this space, and what has come into your gene pool from centuries of trauma can change you. That is a pretty sobering thing to think about. And so if you don't want to lean into that and be sad and depressed all the time, because you can't afford to do that, then you have to tap into your resilience. And that was my point earlier where I said, for chronic stress, there's chronic resilience. I don't think that's a good thing either. So the question is, what do you do? And that's a tough one. And that's what came up to me when we talked about doing this issue. And I kept saying, well, what is it that we can reach out to the world and say, do? And one thing that you brought up when we were getting ready for this session that I thought was interesting is we've often used a term at NLI of perspective taking, where we use perspective taking. And I've seen that word out there. But I think you were kind of leaning into it a little bit there. What's the difference between perspective taking and perspective seeking? Because I'm hoping that when we get clear to that is one of those things we can put out there that would make it easier for us to exist in this space together.
Right. And I'm going to say that and remind me as a placeholder, there's something that came to mind for me about talking about Black women and birth. Thank you. So yeah, perspective taking. Now that's our ability to like kind of step outside of ourselves and like, oh, let me take the perspective of someone else. One, there's like a very like core ability that you even see developmentally among humans, with children at a certain age, where they kind of see everything through their lens. And then at some point they click and they realize, oh, this other person is separate from me and they have a different experience. And so it's kind of like a milestone type of thing. So there's the one common ability of like, do I understand that there are people separate from me who have an experience that's different from mine? So that's an aspect, if you will, of perspective taking, of being able to have that ability, and there are areas in the brain that are indicative of that. And then there's a thing, we kind of talk about perspective taking often in the terms of walking in somebody else's shoes. And there have been some academic scholars who've critiqued that in the sense of like, we really don't know what it's like to walk in somebody's shoes. And I was telling Janet when I went to university, or I grew up in Los Angeles, and there is a range, it's kind of in the middle because socioeconomically, and there was a range, and I was kind of in the middle in terms, yes, of socioeconomics. But when I went to university, when I went to Stanford, there were people of massive extreme wealth, with big names about. And then I remember there was somebody in my school who her family never had she was basically from a family who were itinerant farmers. And so I don't even know, I think they wrote about her, and I don't even know if she ever had her own bed. She always had to sleep on the floor. So like being at Stanford was her first time of like having a home with the bed and warm meals and all of that. And then, there's this whole range. And I was telling Janet, like, I can imagine maybe what it's like to be extremely wealthy, even if I know, and I do know some of those people, I don't know. I can only imagine. Either way, I don't know. So
how can you really take perspective, right?
And that's kind of at best. But then there are other ones of like, oh, those people, they really should be doing this. I mean, I can imagine what it's like, but we pass judgment. So the thing is now when we want to have change, it's really good that we know that other people have an experience different from our own, but really to move the dial, we have to perspective see. So we do need to engage with people. You have to get to know people, understand what have them tell you, but again, not in terms of Prussian Olympics or like, ooh, tell me of your struggles. Like, you need to be really engaged and earnest about it, but let them share what they choose with you rather than you're just assuming. So
I'd be curious to know what happens in the brain of someone who perspective seeks when the light bulb goes off. I mean, we talk about eureka moments and those kind of things, but I would be really interested in figuring out what happens in the brain if you put those people in those MRIs and you had somebody able to ask a question and suddenly they are able to see. They can't really take perspective, but just like I went to a school like you did, where it was, a very privileged school. And I went to school with kids who would tell you that they'd never even been around anybody who was different from them. So if I can just imagine that those who did recognize that and did come and try to seek perspective, I know that their lives changed. Some of those people are my friends to this day because of that. You know, they said, you know, I would have never had these conversations if I hadn't gone to school with you. But I really wonder, I would love to have seen at the point when that moment clicked, what was going on in their brains. Did their brains change? We talk about how trauma has changed Black Americans' brains. Would the ability to tap into that trauma, to understand it, even at a level that you never could before, does that change other people's brains? Because to me, that's where the hope is.
Right.
If we can offset that, that's the hope.
And I think there's thing about changing behavior, changing the brain. I think like it probably could register because that's basically like an insight, right? And there's some studies that have shown when people have what essentially deem an insight, you see this change in like electrical activity if you're doing like EEG with the sensors on the scalp, and then you probably see something, some other kind of like activation in terms of blood flow, if you will, at the moment of insight. It might not change the brain structurally, but again, over time, but it could change people's behavior, right? Sometimes we have those insights and like, oh, all of a sudden you see something in a new light and you can't go back to the way you were thinking before. So it's going to change your behavior. And I guess the idea could also be that if you're changing your behavior, then at some point you will be changing your brain in different ways, at least functionally, if not structurally. So, and it's possible. And I think you brought up something really key, Janet. It's like the change has to happen from within, right? Like we don't know until we do know, and you know what that will create. But part of it is to let yourself be open to that, to learn, because you can't force an insight. But when it does come, that's when it's most powerful, and when we're really going to see that behavior change. Because when we make things and we get it, and we kind of made those connections on our own, it becomes then self-relevant to me. And then like we're just human. It makes sense. Whatever things are kind of relevant to us, we're more likely to pay attention to, and more motivated to engage and change.
And that was your point when you asked about being a communicator, what's important. One of the things I know from experience is that people accept change your behavior and understand things better when it is relevant to them. So when we talk about the experience of Black Americans and this intergenerational trauma and all that kind of stuff, I don't want the people who are listening out there to say, well, okay, well, that's on you. That's your problem. No, this is a problem for all of us. It is, we may be the ones experiencing it, but the loss of productivity, the loss of what this costs this organizations in terms of what we can do, that's important for all of us. I mean, I won't even get to the point that if you just want to be a good person and want to do something different in the world, I won't even talk about that. If you're just a person trying to run a business and you care about how do you let people give their best to an organization, we got to be aware that people are coming into every day with a bunch of stuff that they have to manage that goes way back, that they have to deal with. And what can we do to help offset some of that? Now, I promised you told me to remind you to stick a pin in something about Black women and maternity morbidity.
So it goes back again to this intergenerational transmission of trauma and how it literally affects our bodies and our cells. And I took this really fascinating class when I was in grad school at UC Berkeley with a scientist. She was a biologist, but she said she was a social worker at heart, because she started out as a social worker, but did really interesting studies with mice. But it was a class taught in public health, but there was some psychology from the medical school at UCSF, from public health, social work, it was super fascinating. And the professor talked about this study. So this was a number of years ago, and I'll have to find out where it is. But basically, they were finding that African-American women. So anyway, I don't know if you all know that generally African-American women give birth to babies with the lowest birth rate. And again, there are all these things. It doesn't matter your socioeconomic background, your educational level, your access to care. In fact, there were studies that were showing that women from Latin American countries, say immigrants, I believe they had the babies with the highest birth weight. So you could even say, oh, you had to be from, the US and this particular thing. Like they actually, I think it was like the Latina women had the babies with the highest birth rate, and then white women, and then I think Asian women, and then Black women, kind of on that scale. So you have that to begin with. So they found that it basically took 4 generations outside of slavery. And again, some of us are not out of that. My mother was the youngest of 15, and her grandfather was born into slavery. I mean, he was a child when it ended. So for me, it doesn't go that far back. And my mother was college educated. So the thing is, they said it takes 4 generations, like 4 generations where you're not in poverty, basically middle class and above, and like college educated, for the babies, those Black babies, to be of kind of a standard normal birth rate.
Wow.
So like literally, and it doesn't matter, you could be super wealthy, super highly educated, you're still going to have that low birth rate baby. So they're just seeing how long it takes for it to work through. So it was like 4 generations.
And you think about that, that's a physical manifestation of it. Psychologically, what's going on in the brain? Once again, we talked about that. What does weathering really mean? And if I think of anything, you asked me kind of what's coming up for me. What came up for me when we started talking about this topic was Juneteenth is not something that happened, centuries ago in my mind. It's something that is indicative of what still happens today from a different source, but that is part of and I mean literally part of our DNA. And so if we're going to break this cycle somehow, you said it takes 4 generations before a baby can be born normal birth weight. How many generations is it going to take for us in our daily lives to get to the point where we're not living like this, where this changes? I don't know the answer to that, but I'd like to think that by looking at it this way, through this lens, we have a more objective way of talking about something that we can do. I mean, I'm past the let's just all get along. No, that's not what I mean. I'm saying let's look at what actually goes on in our brains. What can we actually do that's objective in our worlds that we can start changing some of this? Because I'd hate to think it's going to take another 4 generations before some of this stuff changes. It might, but I'm hoping that it doesn't have to if we can look at it this way.
And it's almost like, again, because we're centering this on African Americans, and again, not minimizing the experience of all kinds of people and adversities they've experienced. But when we think about it, like there are ways, like as a group, where we've coped, right? We have our families, you go to church, you have all these different aspects of, okay, you get through it, you can relate to one another. But to your point, societally, we all have to, I don't know if we want to say solve, but like work through this together, because otherwise we're like the strong Black woman, like I have to be strong for everybody because then I'll disappoint or I won't live up to it. And it's like, no, it's not just for us to do. It's like, this is for all of us to do. And I know that's big and that's lofty, but I think we can start, with simple steps, like you were saying, it's like perspective seeking. How do we see the humanity? How do we see the humanity, the human in the other person across from us? Because we don't want to take it 4 generations. And again, that 4 generations is assuming you are not in poverty,
right?
You're,
right.
You're middle class, upper middle class, you're college educated, and that's
so it could take longer if the generations don't change.
Exactly, that's when that clock starts. There's a lot there, and I know we have a lot happening in the chat. A lot of
questions. I see them.
I haven't had a chance, so maybe
I haven't either. I hope somebody on our team has been watching this.
Yeah, if something's popped out from anybody, Shelby, that you've seen. Otherwise, just give Janet and me a moment to take a look to see what's here.
Yeah, I have no way I'm going to be able to get through this whole thing, but
I just want to note Olivier's comment about isolation. You said isolation is really leading people to depression. We need to normalize it's more than okay to ask for help in case of struggle. And that just goes with everything. It's so key. Like isolation, loneliness is such a big public health issue. And that can lead, not only to depression, but actually death as well. So just want to note that. And there's that part of we need to be able, and I say we very broadly, to reach out and make those connections and ask for help and support. And there was something go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Oh, no, that's all right. Okay,
I saw one thing, I think it was Anthony, that said folks and organizations ask Black Americans to get over it and give no credence to the fact that some of us are able to get over it because of our strong constitution, and others are regular human beings and often suffer mental anguish. That's a very good point. That's my fear when we celebrate resilience, because I can get turned back on you very quickly and say, okay, so you're resilient. And the thing is, the situation needs to change. Like I say, chronic oppression is not okay. Chronic stress is not okay, but chronic resilience is not okay either. I'm going to give it that term, chronic resilience. We don't want to have to do that. I mean, wouldn't it be nice to just not have to worry about it all the time? The world doesn't change that quickly. I'm not dumb, but I do think that organizations have, if individuals don't want to do it, I think organizations there's a positive benefit to organizations to build systems. You mentioned that, Michaela, to build systems of equity so that you can take some of that need for the constant and chronic resilience away. Organizations can do that. That's what they can do. Individuals can do it. But like I said, at the end of the day, just like some of the stress is intergenerational, a lot of what causes that stress is systemic. So if we don't fix the systems, that stress stays there. And that's what organizations and people who are in organizations making decisions can do. They can look at the systems and say, are they fair? Is there equity in those systems? We talk about that a lot with the new point of view in the DEI practice, which is basically that you prioritize diversity organizationally, you leverage it with habits of inclusion, and then you sustain it with systems of equity, because that is what an organization can do. Individuals can do only so much. You cannot solve systemic inequity with interpersonal solutions. You have to have systemic equity. And that is what, when we talk about what people can and cannot do, how well they can deliver, how much they can contribute, that should be an incentive for organizations to want to try to fix this.
Right. Exactly. Because again, ultimately for businesses, right, you want to not just survive, thrive, and you're thinking your bottom line. So like, what's going to get your people in the best place so they can do what they need to do? I mean, how do we remove those barriers to make it? Yeah, very much so. And I just also want to acknowledge something, like I was thinking like that kind of chronic resilience, because there's kind of underlying all of that. And one could say, and there are probably critiques out there, around even our way that we frame resilience, but it's this sense of like, it's also appearance, right? Because it's like, man, you've been through so much. It's amazing that you're not, a total wreck and in bed with the covers over your head and paralyzed or in despair and depressed. And because you show up, is almost like, okay, you're good, but we don't know what's happening behind there. Right. And the mental anguish that people are experiencing. And this goes into discussion around mental health generally in the workplace. And just because something is not visible doesn't mean it's not there. And how do we account for that? And what systems can we put in place even in the workplace to account for the invisible mental anguish? And so I just want to acknowledge that takes its toll. And somebody else came along who said the body was not designed to take that type of stress on a consistent basis. Exactly. But again, it's the interpersonal, but to your point, Janet, also want to recognize how systems, how critical they are to this as well.
Absolutely. Well, I know we are getting towards time, and I'm thinking there are few things we want to talk about. So first of all, Michaela, thank you as always.
My pleasure.
For a wonderful conversation. And I want you all to know we do this in our spare time. We're just doing what we do on a regular basis. That's how it rolls around here. So I really appreciate you bringing that brain-based perspective to this issue so that we can understand that, there are things we can't undo, but there are things we can do. We can't change the past, but we can certainly then think about how we do things to make for a better future and for a better present. So that's what I'm hoping everybody will get out of this. So thank you for that.
My pleasure.
Okay, now I don't know if we have the ability to show slides, so I'm going to throw some things out here, some things that are going on at NLI right now in the DEI space that you may find interesting. Like I said, I don't know if we can put a slide up, fine. You haven't put it up yet, so maybe we can't. But a couple of things that are going on. We've got a couple of new programs that we're doing. Those of you who are interested in the DEI Masterclass, it's back. It's coming back. It'll start again in September 20th of September 25th is when it will start. If you're interested in that, put it in the chat. You can get more information about it. We also have created and are going to have available soon a new workshop about how to interrupt implicit bias in business decisions. That's a new one. That's going to be available soon. And we've done and are ready to change and working on some onboarding workshops for people who are in the DEI space, both practitioners and leaders. We also have under construction a DEI industry brief. And we're calling it a DEI industry brief, but it really is an explanation of what the state of DEI is and why that's important to business, what's happening in business that makes DEI more important, and what people who are in the DEI space need to be thinking about in order to make sure that we sustain this work. Because if you've been paying attention at all, you understand that a lot of work in the DEI space is kind of going away now. People were real excited about it in 2020, but now we're in 2023 and they're not so much. So what is it that we need to be doing and saying differently? How do we need to be viewing it differently? There it is. Okay, good. So I can talk to it. So you see the things I mentioned in terms of education. You see the thing I mentioned in terms of the briefings. That one in the middle about research. We have two exciting research initiatives underway right now. One is a survey that is asking organizations that are not in academia what they think is going to happen with the SCOTUS decision, the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action in higher ed admissions. Do we think that it's going to have an effect in the corporate and nonprofit worlds outside of academia? Do we think there's going to be an issue there? What are we doing to prepare for that? That's a survey that we're trying to get done pretty quickly because the decision's coming down, I think, the end of this month. And the other is a much longer research study that we're going to do, where we are going to organizations and asking them to participate in the study so that we can finally have some truly causative results out in the world about the value of DEI. We have all seen the stats about, organizations are more profitable if they have a certain level of percentage of diversity. We don't know that diversity is what's doing that. We believe it is. There's a correlative effect, but we don't really know. So we want to figure out, we want to make it causative. So we're going to start looking at organizations that are interested in being part of this study and tying DEI directly to business outcomes to see what happens. Either way, they haven't already dropped it in there. They're going to drop a link in the chat to a page that will give you access to those studies. And if you're interested in being a part of that, we would love to have you as a part of it. So I think that's all I had for today. And so I'm happy to turn it back over to Shelby. I want to thank you all for joining us today, being part of this discussion. As always, drop in the chat if you want to talk about something else. If you're interested in us doing something else in space, we're happy to do it. And we look forward to seeing you on the next one.
Nice. Thank you so much, Janet and Michaela. That conversation was so powerful and very relatable. So we thank you for your time again. And for everyone joining us, thank you. As we always say, we have a poll coming up. Let us know how NLI can help you in the future. That'll stay up for a few more moments. As far as being here, thank you again. We just really appreciate you. We can't have these conversations without you. If you're interested, we'd love to hear your feedback. So if you have ideas for future episodes, please let us know more of what you'd like to see. We'll share a link in the chat for that. Insider Exchange, this is specifically for our senior executives. So if you enjoy your Brain at Work Live, we think you'll love this insider program. It's an exclusive opportunity to have roundtable discussions with our leaders and get a first look at innovation. So if you're interested, we will also share the link to that. Also the podcast. If you enjoyed today's conversation, you'll love the podcast. So look for your Brain at Work wherever you listen, and there will be episodes waiting for you. And Summit, early bird registration is now live. So if you are interested, we're very excited. We've been working a lot behind the scenes and looking forward to putting on a wonderful event this year. So visit neuroleadership.com/summit for more information. And this is where we say farewell. So thank you on behalf of our team behind the scenes. We really appreciate you, and we will see you here next time. Have a wonderful day.